It's a very sunny Saturday morning, and wherever you are, you're welcome to the Focus on Zed 101.9 FM, your lifestyle, leisure, and business platform. Today on the Focus, we're going to be discussing or asking the question of whether Ghana can sustain economic recovery without the IMF. As you may be aware, the IMF program with Ghana ended recently. And a lot of people had said, and in fact, there had been a lot of projections saying that our economic stability was because of the presence of IMF. So we're asking the question today, whether looking at the indicators, what we have put in place, whether Ghana can sustain its economic recovery without the IMF's cracking its whip. And again, we'll look at whether Ghana is ready for growth without compromising its stability, especially since BOG has held its policy rate at 14%. My name is Kweku Atakra Jumo, and for the next 2 hours, we're going to be having this economic conversation on how to make our country better. You can join us via text on our WhatsApp line 0544321019, 0544321019. You can join us on our social media handles on ZFMGH, on Facebook, or on YouTube and TikTok platforms. You can join us on Zed Multimedia. If you want to listen to us on the internet around the world, it's www.zedmultimedia.com. We'll take a short breather here. When we come back, we'll take news from around the world in the Focus Rolls. If you're just tuning in, you're welcome to the Focus on Zed 101.9 FM. And today we're discussing or interrogating the question of whether Ghana can sustain its economic recovery without the IMF and whether Ghana is ready for growth without compromising the stability, especially since the Bank of Ghana has held its policy rate at 14%. But before we go into the conversation, for news around the world, the India-Africa Forum Summit, scheduled to take place in New Delhi from the 28th to the 31st of May, has been postponed because of concerns over the Ebola outbreak in parts of Africa. In a joint statement, India and the African Union said the decision was taken due to what they described as an emerging public health situation on the continent. A new date for the summit will be announced later. The World Health Organization, as the WHO, has declared the current Ebola outbreak a public health emergency of international concern. So far, there are about 600 suspected cases and 139 deaths, mainly reported in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda. Health experts say this outbreak is particularly concerning because it involves a rare strain of Ebola for which there is currently no approved vaccine, and it is occurring in areas affected by ongoing conflict. Although no cases have been reported in India, health authorities have issued an advisory for travelers arriving from affected regions. They are being asked to monitor their health for up to 21 days and seek medical attention if symptoms develop. Officials say the summit will be rescheduled once the public health situation improves. In Canada also, the Canadian province of Alberta is set to hold a referendum on whether it should remain part of Canada or move towards a potential path to independence. Premier Danielle Smith announced that the vote will take place on 19 October following growing pressure from separatist groups and petitions both supporting and opposing separation, which together gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. The referendum question will ask voters whether Alberta should remain in Canada or begin the legal process toward a binding vote on independence. Smith said she personally supports Alberta remaining in Canada and that this is also the position of her government, but she stressed that Albertans must be allowed to decide the province's future. The move comes amid rising separatist sentiments in the oil-rich Western province, where some residents argue that Alberta contributes more to the national economy than it receives, and that federal policies have limited its energy sector. However, opinion polls suggest more Albertans are expected to vote against separation. Canada's federal government, led by Prime Minister Makane, has insisted that any move towards independence must follow the country's legal framework, including the Clarity Act, which set out conditions for any potential separation process. Still on Ebola, an Ebola treatment facility in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo has been set on fire by an angry crowd at the center of the current outbreak. The incident happened at Rampara General Hospital near the city of Bunaya in Ituri province after family and friends of a man suspected to have died from Ebola tried to retrieve his body for burial. Witnesses say protesters threw stones at the hospital and torched tents being used as isolation wards. Police fired warning shots to disperse the crowd and restore order. Local officials say the body of Ebola victims must be handled under strict health protocols to prevent further transmission of the highly infectious disease. A local politician, Luke Malemba, said misinformation and disbelief about Ebola is fueling anger in some communities, with some residents refusing to accept the disease exists. Health workers were briefly placed under military protection as security forces intervened. One medical worker was injured during the unrest. Authorities say the situation is now under control and patients who were in the treatment tents are safe and receiving care. The World Health Organization says the outbreak has already killed more than 170 people in the region, with hundreds of suspected cases reported. And here in Ghana, His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama has assured residents of the Savannah region that electrification projects in the area will begin within the next month. The president gave the assurance during a visit to Saula Primary School to inspect the implementation of STEM education. He said the Minister for Energy and Green Transition had confirmed that contracts had already been awarded, while contractors had visited project sites and started mobilization ahead of construction works. President Mahama noted that the Savannah region remains one of the most undeserved areas in electricity supply and said government underserved areas in electricity supply and said government is committed to closing the development gap through improved infrastructure. He stressed that the reliable electricity is critical for the success of STEM education and broader socio-economic development, adding that no region will be left behind in the national development agenda. And the AMA, that's the Accra Metropolitan Assembly, has also donated 16 streetlights to traders at Katamantu market to improve security, visibility, and trading conditions within the busy commercial center. The donation followed engagements between the assembly and the market leaders over concerns about poor lighting, especially during the early morning and evening trading hours. Presenting the items, Deputy Director in charge of the 24-hour Economy Office at the AMA, Nisa Kumkole, said the initiative forms part of the Assembly's effort to create a safer and more convenient environment for traders and customers. He explained that the initial batch of streetlights will allow installation works to begin while additional support is being secured. President of Katamantu Market, Opoku Afre, welcomed the donation and described it as a significant step in strengthening cooperation between the assembly and traders at the market. Many thanks for staying with us. Still the Focus on Zed 101.9 FM. I have my guest seated in studio. We'll take a very short breather here. When we come back, we'll launch right into the main conversation. Do not go away. It's on Zed 101.9 FM, your lifestyle, leisure, and business platform. Today, for our conversation, I have with me in studio Jordan Sika Nati, who is a senior research associate with Loris Africa. Jordan, you're welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
And I also have with me John Che, who is a financial analyst. John, you're welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Right, soon I'll have joining me online Dr. Evans Nunu, who is a financial economist. And we are all going to interrogate the very important question of whether Ghana can sustain its economic recovery without the IMF. But let me find out from you, generally, from your impressions, that while Ghana was under the IMF program, I mean, what were your general impressions before we look at Ghana after IMF? Maybe let me start with John.
Okay.
Thank you, and good morning to all your listeners. I think generally we have been very disciplined in terms of, meeting the conditions of IMF. If we look at, the numbers and even getting the final tranche, it shows that, Ghana was able to, accomplish a lot in terms of macroeconomic stability, and we are seeing that in terms of lowered inflation. We are seeing, government expenditure being anchored on growth and the rest. So generally, I think we have done well, and we have been very disciplined with meeting all the conditions.
Oh, you think we have been disciplined? How about you, Jordan?
Well, I think overall we've been able to gain some, macroeconomic stability from the program. When you draw into the numbers, right, and the kind of economic emergency stress under which we were before we went to the program, and then looking at where we are now, I think generally you see some strong macro economic recovery across board. We went there with very high debt levels, GDP ratio sitting over 70%. We had inflation crossing 50%. Government also lost significant credibility, and because of that, we had multiple downgrades. I think quite recently, Fitch placed us back at B with a stable outlook, and interest rate since that period has considerably declined. Just yesterday at government auction, 91 days, still hovering around the 4 to 5% range. You have the 364 still around the 10% range, and the like. So really all these reflect very impressive macroeconomic recovery from the program. And for me, I think like my colleague mentioned, discipline has been a key anchor of this. Yeah.
Right. And you rightfully mentioned economic recovery. Typically, our economy, or previously, our economy had been hinged heavily on our oil sector and our oil production. But do you think within our IMF, we were able to properly leverage on our other sectors?
Okay. I think that is one key thing that we haven't been able to significantly achieve under the period, under the IMF program. And I can understand why. When it comes to diversifying growth base and, government revenues, it takes time a bit, So I wouldn't have, I think it would be harsh on the government if I had expected within the last 3 years for them to achieve all this. However, I think what the program has set to do in dealing with this challenge is the fact that it's been clear in setting, the tone going forward in terms of growth in the future. Under the program, we've been able to, in a way, diversify slightly from I think under the during the program
Yeah.
period, our cocoa sector wasn't doing well. But prior to the program, the cocoa sector was one of the engines actually powering growth for our economy, especially around the agriculture sector. I think the program has done quite well in pushing the government to look into the crop sector, right? And I think prior to that, the administration at that time had a planting for food and job, which it has been able to broaden that. We now have other agricultural programs from the current administration as well, which is helping to do that. Also in the extractive sector, I think we've been able to diversify a bit, but it's still around the mining segment. You know, we're initially getting more returns from crude, but as we speak, I think it's clear gold has taken over. We haven't been able to do much, even though the services sector continue to boom, right, and continue to be a standout engine for growth. We haven't been able to accumulate much from it as a country, and I think going forward, those are the key areas that we'll have to look out for. The cost of trades, interest rates, you know, monetary policy environment, our currency, all these things influence these particular sectors. Yeah.
Right, so then isn't that going to be worrying? Because when we had our IMF, that's our headmaster around, we couldn't do much in the developing these sectors. Now that they are leaving, shouldn't that be worrying for us, especially for economic figures?
Yes, it should be, but the good thing is that I mean, I mentioned how these are macroeconomic indicators affect these key sectors. When you go into the industry, a subsector like the manufacturing segment, you know, they are still, we had some challenges, especially with high cost of power and then electricity in that to support that subsector, that's the manufacturing subsector.
Yeah.
One of the issues that was powering the challenges in the sector was a huge debt to our IPPs. And then I think considerably the program was able to help us deal with it. At least we were able to do some restructuring of debts and also settle some debts in that sector. So the expectation going forward, right, is that with that huge toll dealt with, the government should now have leverage to move on to other key issues. When that is solved, then you can now see the impact on these manufacturing firms, because I think still across even our SSA region and also comparing to developing peers, our cost of electricity is still high, and that makes it difficult for an ordinary manufacturing business in Ghana to price well to compete with its peers. Yeah.
Okay, let me turn to John. I mean, still in this region, do you think that the IMF, and while we are the IMF, we were able to develop a non-oil sector?
Okay, so if you look at, I mean, the period and IMF, you realize that it was more of government expenditure prioritization that really helped in achieving these economic numbers. You realize that.
So not necessarily the development of other sectors.
The development of the other sectors, and you see that it was more of, I mean, government trying to, I mean, rationalize its deficit through delayed, I mean, so sometimes through delayed audits and a whole lot of things, and then capital expenditure seriously cut. You look at maybe the employment in the government sector to reduce. So you realize that in 2024, 2025, especially when the new government took over, it was more of stability. They really wanted to achieve stability before maybe looking at the other sectors. And so personally, I feel there are a lot of things that have been delayed, especially even, I mean, embarking on their flagship projects.
But if you make this point, then is it again not worrying? Because if it was just to control government expenditure, if government expenditure goes higher, it means that then we don't have any cushion.
It is. But you see, the good thing is that, you see, as we were doing all these things, I mean, we try also to find way to reduce lending rate.
Yeah.
And the idea is that as far as we're able to reduce lending rate and government is no more competing with the private sector for credit. I think just in the Bank of Ghana report, they announced that private sector growth has seen about 24% jump compared to last year, which was around even 1% contraction. So we are seeing that, I mean, whatever the stability that we are achieving is also translating into, I mean, lower lending rates. And that is really going to be the anchor to drive private sector growth. And that is where maybe we will be moving away from the stabilization to the growth. But we're also seeing a lot of risk factors, I mean, coming in, especially the war going on, and as a result, fuel price going up. And I think I've mentioned earlier that this is a time that government, you see, if you have been able to reduce, let's say, lending rate to 10%, where maybe the Bank of Ghana governor is aiming at even a single rate just to promote private sector. If these risks are also, I mean, strengthening that stability, then it's really going to be a big problem. Because see, whatever government did maybe last year, it was because it's a new government and people understood, the ministries understood. We are under IMF. I mean, the finance, whatever the finance minister will explain to cabinet, they, I mean, understand from that point of view. But now that we have no more IMF, and now that they are in their second year of government, I don't think people are going to be more patient again in terms of, I mean, waiting for your flagship projects to start. And we are seeing now they are doing a lot of, I mean, big push project, and all these things are going to drive, I mean, government expenditure. Especially also seeing them, I mean, employing more people now into the education sector.
The government spending is going to go higher.
So we are seeing a significant increase in government expenditure. It's starting. Okay, so I mean the numbers will not remain the same. But the good thing is that as far as, I mean, the interest rate is dropping and treasury rate is so low, we believe that the banks will more focus on the private sector and give more credit, and that can be the turning point. But if that is not achieved and the risk factors happening now escalate, where fuel price now move beyond 20 and Bank of Ghana needs to now take action, then the reduce, I mean, the rate that is reducing will reverse, and that will, I mean, be a catastrophic for us, especially after this year going to election year where government announced to
exactly,
spend
because
more.
then I was looking at also the fact that as we are approaching election year, spending goes higher.
Exactly the point.
Spending in terms of election spending, in terms of even infrastructure, so that it makes even a government look. All of these things are huge cost on the government. Exactly.
Yes, especially to economic recovery. So personally, I don't think we have arrived yet. Okay, especially when all the things that we did, I mean, especially last 2 years was about government expenditure cuts, prioritization. There are even a lot of debt that, I mean, because it was a new government, the creditors understood for renegotiation and no delays in payment. And even if we also go back to the debt exchange program, where we postpone a lot of debt payment into 2026, 2027, 2028, it clearly shows that more expenditure is coming. And that is a very, I mean, a great risk to our economic recovery. And I think that's maybe the reason why maybe they decided that we will not move away from IMF. At least if IMF still our, you know, we have not really moved away. We have just moved to a coordination program, so that at least, I mean, in terms of the government, they will still, I mean, be disciplined a bit, no matter the pressures that will evolve.
But in that coordination program, what's the extent of the responsibility of the IMF to Ghana?
Okay, so you see, one thing we need to understand is that we lost too much investor confidence as a result of the debt exchange program. And the external creditors are still, I mean, afraid in terms of what we can do in the future. But once, I mean, you go under IMF, you are just telling your creditors that you are willing to still be disciplined. So it's more of trying to send a signal out there that even though we are moving out of IMF, we are not going to do business as usual. We still want IMF to supervise the things that we do, to give credibility to all our actions. And I think that's the major, I mean, and I think it's a very good thing to do, okay, because, I mean, historically, you realize that we have not been good in terms of self-discipline.
Yeah.
And you know, it's also good for the finance minister because, I mean, they can still use IMF as a reason to rationalize expenditure and the rest. But once we're out of IMF and everybody knows that we are no more IMF, so we can do whatever we like, there'll be a lot of pressures on the finance ministry to take certain decisions, and that can reverse our gains. So I think this new program is going to help still bring that confidence, especially at the external front, so that they still believe that Ghana is still, I mean, it's not compulsory to go under this program, but we are willing to subject ourselves to IMF oversight. And I think it will bring that confidence back, especially in the external sector. And I mean, the credit ratings are seeing all these things, and they will continue to improve our credit ratings.
Right. In your submissions, you made mention of the bank supporting the private sector.
Okay.
In all of this, if IMF was largely an issue of checking government spending and all that, in all of this, now that we are trying to wean ourselves from the IMF, shouldn't government also now channel a lot of its energy to the private sector? A lot of the government projects, which government is leading by itself, wouldn't it have been better if private sector led? Like, let's say some of their flagship on agriculture, these in Konketikiti and all that. Wouldn't it have been better if private sector led those flagships so that we have a diversified economy?
Yes, I believe so. And I think it's not like government is just playing the leading role. But if you look at the contrast and the rest, they are doing with the private sector. In fact, even if you look at the big push, they are, I mean, coordinating with the private sector in terms of the projects. Just that you see, as far as government is concerned, we understand the inefficiencies. Okay, I think recently the road minister was moving around checking. I don't think if private sector was leading that charge, you can take private sector money and decide not to work. It can never happen. So maybe it's good that, I mean, they partner with the private sector. Some of the projects that, I mean, requests, I mean, a lot of funding. As far as, government and politics, economy are concerned, there could be a lot of inefficiencies, and you put money in there and you are not getting results. So if you allow the private sector to lead, it's more about coordination and allowing them to supervise some of these works. And I think they'll be more efficient even in terms of pricing. Okay, because the problem has been, I mean, we know government can default on payment, so it leads to a lot of cost overruns, especially when it comes to, I mean, charging for government projects. So if you allow the private sector to, I mean, lead some of these flagship programs which require a lot of funding, I mean, it's going to bring efficiency in that space. And all the monies released in that space can, I mean, lead to economic growth.
I mean, I'm going to come to Mark Jordan to ask him about industrialization and technology, but I'll stay with you just for a second before I go to Mark Jordan. So now on this private sector bit, do you foresee a time where a whole sector of our economy will just be private sector led?
So I'm not sure it will happen. I mean, because you see, the issue is that, the government is the highest spender. Okay, and sometimes, I mean, all over the world, there are certain sectors that no matter what, you still have to play a key role. Because, when you leave to the private sector, sometimes, they are more profit seeking. So,
but if they are profit seeking, but they'll bring efficiency.
That is why, I mean, you see, our PPPs arrangement, public-private partnership arrangements, sometimes we normally make it a whole, but there are some places like UK that even in the health sector, they have a lot of PPP arrangement. It's been very efficient and effective and delivering the result that they are looking for. But in Ghana here, even the PPPs, I mean, people go under it and do a whole lot of things. But if you could do that, I mean, effectively, where maybe you enter into PPP arrangements in some of these things we are talking about, it will be, I mean, and allow maybe still IMF to be supervising, I mean.
No, see, I'm even asking this because if you take some sectors, if you take some countries, government will just have an oversight responsibility.
Exactly.
Say, let's say railway.
Yeah.
Government, yes, the railway sector will still have the oversight. They will approve of their markings and their projects and all, funding and all. But it's left purely the private sector, develop it like a PPP, I mean, build it, operate it, eventually you transfer.
Yes.
But then the private sector, because it knows it must recover its investment, it manages it very efficiently for maybe a period of 10 years or 20 years or 30 or whatever the arrangement is before it hands over to government.
Yes.
Now, that you see that it's it improves the country.
Exactly.
As opposed to that which the government is sitting at the helm, then they just outsource a little part to a private sector. The private sector comes in to do the work, but there's a huge government bottleneck.
Exactly.
It can't move.
Yes, I agree with you. So I think maybe going forward, I think what you have suggested is very key, where maybe certain sectors like maybe even the tourism sector, I mean, and there are even state-owned enterprises currently like Gogo and the rest doing very well because they were listed and therefore it's no more of government control.
Exactly.
So there are a lot of, government projects that, as far as history suggests, that we have not been efficient as when it comes to government leading projects. Then this is the best time when, and at this moment, you can even be giving money to the private sector. So you are even funding the programs, but you give it to the private sector at a lower interest rate for them to pursue such projects. And I'm sure we will have a lot of efficiency.
Because a good point you made, if you're on the health, recently when our health issues came, the hospitals and doctors, now people would have said that this wouldn't have happened in a private hospital.
Exactly.
And if such a comment can be made, then it means that there's some efficiency the private sector brings in, which government at certain points you need to appreciate the fact that government has its problems. And let's let the private sector lead at certain points.
I agree perfectly. I agree perfectly. I think that should be the way forward, especially when we now want to be more sufficient. I think we really need to partner with the private sector, allow them to lead most of these things. That's why I said we can. Personally, I've been, promoting, because you see, we have moved from last 2 years, we're more of demand driven, where we are controlling demand in order to achieve the numbers we have. This is the right time for supply side, where we now allow the private sector to lead the growth. And that's why I really appreciate the fact that Treasury bill rate has come to about 4%. I don't think now banks feel comfortable lending to government. So in that case, and governments can come in, even if you have the money, you can budget where you give those monies to the private sector to lead some of these groups. And I think it will bring high returns.
All right, I turn to you, Mark Jordan. On industrialization and technology. So we are talking about whether we're going to sustain our economic recovery without the IMF. But it looks like since 1957 or ever since we've been in existence, many of our things are done at a very subsistence or primary level. If we are talking about, let's say, developing some other sectors, if we look at agriculture, still agriculture is largely, we don't have the mechanized agriculture we see in other parts of our world. Do you think that we should start thinking of how we can be injecting technology and industrialization in our sectors of our economy to help sustain our economic growth?
I think it's a clear yes. It's a clear yes because that is where the world is actually moving towards. I remember during the week I was speaking to a colleague and it was around this same issue, and I was telling the colleague that we had said that the world moved from industrialization to the service era and then information era